Ned Stark was introduced as the Lord of Winterfell and the Warden of the North in the Game of Thrones. He was the head of House Stark, one of the most noble, ancient, and great houses of Westeros. When he was granted the title of Hand of the King, he's thrown into a game that ends up killing him and threatens the very existence of his house. How did things spiral out of control so quickly for a man who was technically one of the most powerful lords in the realm? To put it shortly, he made a lot of questionable decisions, and he also had a few other players plotting on his downfall. In this video, I'm going to discuss some of the events that transpired which led to Ned becoming Hand of the King, and provide some commentary for some of his mistakes, and the events that led to his death shortly afterward. Ned was the second son of Rickard and Lyanna Stark. His older brother, Brandon, was groomed to be the Lord of Winterfell, and he was also the original suitor for Catelyn Tully. As the second son with no lands and titles to be inherited, Ned was fostered in the Vale by Jon Arryn alongside Robert Baratheon. This was the period where Jon became like a second father to him, and Robert became his close friend. Unfortunately for Ned and the rest of House Stark, Rickard and Brandon were killed on the orders of the Mad King, and Ned was forced to step up and become the head of his house. However, Ned's tenure as the Warden of the North turned out to be quite respectable. He was known to be an honorable man with a strong sense of justice, a notable attachment to the North, and no particular interest in Southern affairs. Although he never asked or expected to be the Lord of Winterfell, he was eventually all but forced to inherit another title, one that came with its fair share of danger and responsibility. Ned was forced into the game by the actions of Petyr Baelish, with the help of Lysa Arryn. Lord Baelish, also known as Littlefinger, managed to convince Lysa to murder her husband Jon Arryn with the tears of Lys. With the realm in need of a new Hand of the King, Robert Baratheon would turn to his old friend to get the job done. Ironically, this was quite literally the last thing in the world he wanted, and Ned initially planned on rejecting Robert's offer, despite the fact that he would be granted a more powerful title and the chance to marry his daughter into the royal family. Ned knew that becoming Hand was a responsibility as large as the realm itself, especially with a king like Robert, who planned on eating, drinking, and whoring all day. While the average lord would dream of the day where they'd be offered the same opportunity, Ned was content with being the Warden of the North and being closer to his family. Had things remained unchanged, perhaps he would have stayed at Winterfell, but Ned and his wife Catelyn fell victim to Littlefinger's scheme to pit the Starks against the Lannisters. When Catelyn receives a letter from her sister Lysa claiming that Jon Arryn was murdered by the Lannisters, Ned eventually felt the need to do right by Jon and his family by finding the truth behind his murder. Before riding south to King's Landing, King Robert, Ned, and a few other men go hunting. While everyone is away, Ned's son Bran catches Jaime and Queen Cersei in the act and is pushed into a fall by the former. While everyone believes it was an accidental fall at first, this would later have a major effect on the relationship between the Starks and the Lannisters. Ned wasn't very fond of the Lannisters to begin with, in large part due to the events that transpired during Robert's rebellion, where Tywin Lannister was late to join their cause, and Jaime Lannister murdered the king he was sworn to protect. On the journey to the capital, we see a stark contrast in morals and values between Ned and his old friend Robert. Ned would rather not talk about the one time he allegedly dishonored his wife, while Robert is open to the idea of them going out and finding women. Ned still feels slighted by the dishonor that Jorah Mormont brought to the north, while Robert is actively using him to spy on his enemies. Ned feels like murdering Daenerys would be a crime, while Robert is eager to see her dead. The entire dialogue between Ned and Robert in this scene is a back and forth representation on how far apart they are from each other on pretty much everything. This wasn't a good sign for Ned, who rode south in hopes of finding justice for Jon Arryn, now realizing that he rode south with a king who was opposed to everything he stood for. Before the traveling party reaches King's Landing, the tension between the houses of Stark and Lannister was rekindled. While the men are out hunting near the woods of the Trident, Arya and Joffrey are involved in an incident that ends with the Crown Prince getting bit by Nymeria, Arya's direwolf. This resulted in Queen Cersei asserting her dominance over the Starks by having the innocent direwolf lady killed in place of Nymeria, which was her way of achieving some sort of moral victory against them and effectively hitting them where it hurts. While this wasn't the result of some plot or scheme by the Queen or anyone, this incident puts the Starks in distress and incites a feud between Arya and Sansa. When the King's party finally arrives in King's Landing, Littlefinger would immediately capitalize on the latest opportunity to deepen the conflict between the two great houses. While Ned was traveling south, an assassin was hired to murder his son Bran. The Catspaw was armed with a Valyrian steel dagger that Catelyn brings with her to the capital to be featured in her investigation. Upon showing it to Littlefinger, he claims the dagger was his until he lost it in a wager to Tyrion Lannister. Ned would be told the same story, and despite his doubts about trusting Littlefinger, he decided to accept this claim because of the relationship that he shared with Catelyn in the past and his recent conflict with the Lannisters on the King's Road. Little did Ned and Catelyn know, they were already a few layers deep into Littlefinger's scheme. They were both forced to dissect the matter of affairs under the belief that Lysa warned them about the Lannisters in good faith, and therefore were more open to believe any additional accusations. Littlefinger knew this and took advantage of it. However, this was actually a wildcard play that depended on how Ned and Catelyn would react to it. This was because Peter actually lost the Valyrian steel dagger to King Robert, who later misplaces it. Had Ned not taken the Tyrion bait, he might have tried to confirm if Littlefinger was telling the truth. Confirming who won the dagger that day wouldn't have been difficult because the wager took place in a public setting. If Ned found out the dagger was Robert's or misplaced by Robert, it's hard to say what he would have done. Accusing the king would probably have been a dead end, and up to this point, the author, George Martin, did a good job with all but destroying the faith Ned had in Robert, which would have made an open dialogue between them to try and get to the bottom of this unlikely. Of course, Robert had nothing to do with the attempt on Bran's life. The dagger actually ended up in the hands of Prince Joffrey, who wanted to have Bran killed in order to impress Robert. So while the Lannisters were technically involved in this scheme, it's suggested by Tyrion and Jaime that Joffrey acted independently. Ned ultimately decided to focus on Jon Arryn's murder, but this was his first real shot at overcoming deception. He already had a feeling that something was off about the dagger, and if he discovered that Tyrion was being framed by Littlefinger, he might have caught on to the fact that he was being deceived all along. Despite what Ned could have done, he ended up experiencing the consequences of his wife's decisions. Catelyn would decide to jump the gun and seize Tyrion, which led to Tywin torching the Riverlands and Jaime attacking Ned in the streets of King's Landing. In the end, Joffrey's foolish attempt to impress Robert was strategically put to use by Littlefinger. From here, Ned would formally begin his investigation on Jon Arryn's suspicious death. Naturally, he begins with Grand Maester Pycelle, who treated Jon's sudden condition up until his death. Pycelle's claims are full of contradictions and worthy of suspicion. Initially, he claims that Jon was wearing down prior to his death due to his old age and other stressful factors. Moments later, he states that Jon was quite healthy leading up to the day before his death, which is something that Robert said himself the day he arrived at Winterfell. Pycelle doesn't mention any hints of foul play, but when Ned suggests the obvious possibility, Pycelle gets noticeably uncomfortable and suggests that there was no evidence of poison. In hindsight, Pycelle's role in this plotline is interesting to say the least. This is because not only did Pycelle let Jon Arryn die, he did it to protect the secret about the line of succession, which is technically treason against King Robert.
Treason is treason.
Pycelle is a strong advocate of House Lannister, and his decision to let Jon Arryn die led to the War of the Five Kings. Ned would walk away from this conversation knowing that Pycelle's loyalty was questionable, and with a book on the lineages of the Grey Houses. His inquiries would soon lead him back to Littlefinger, who gives him 4 people of interest that were in close contact with Jon or working for him indirectly, one of which helps him discover Gendry, Robert's bastard son. Gendry was the first bastard son that Ned would discover, but he certainly wouldn't be the last. Littlefinger also plays a compelling role in all of this. In the words of Varys, Littlefinger loves Littlefinger. He doesn't serve House Lannister or House Stark. He acts according to his own agenda. While he actively created chaos among these two great houses, he also created different opportunities for himself. Littlefinger willingly tried to keep Ned in the game, knowing that he could use him for his own agenda. But Littlefinger also sprinkled in helpful advice here and there. He opposed retaliation regarding the dagger, telling Ned that it would surely lead toward greater conflict. He exposed some of the people that were spying on Ned for Varys and the Queen, and he even suggested that Ned would be wise to make peace with the Lannisters, even if it were momentarily. Littlefinger put himself in position to side with the winning team by playing both sides, knowing that would give him the best chance to climb the ladder either way. The next sequence of events would literally and figuratively cripple Ned's power and influence. Littlefinger's lie about Tyrion would reach its intended effect when Catelyn takes Tyrion hostage. This is where Ned, once again, could have taken things in a different direction. Ned knew that the entire realm would know about Catelyn and Tyrion sooner rather than later. His priority should have been to speak to Robert and defuse the situation as soon as possible. Instead, Ned keeps it to himself, and the next day, word reaches Varys about Daenerys' pregnancy, and Ned dropped the ball. In theory, Ned should have done whatever it took to maintain his position of power and influence in order to be able to sustain the consequences of his wife's decisions. But when Robert ordered the death of Daenerys, Ned refused to be involved. Instead, he resigned from office and stood against the king in front of the small council. In many ways, Ned's resignation and refusal to be involved with Daenerys' murder is worthy of applause and respect. His honor and his moral compass meant something to him, and that has value. There really was no objective right or wrong here. But Ned didn't make the best decision for him and his family. In fact, you can argue that he put them in danger. Considering the circumstances, his resignation was questionable as much as it was controversial. He was no longer the hand of the king. He left the king on bad terms, and he had to face the wrath of Tywin Lannister. He put his family and potentially the entire North in danger because of his honor and his pride. Ned's curiosity, thanks to Littlefinger, would keep him in King's Landing long enough to be confronted by Jaime, who attacked Ned and his men on their way back to the Red Keep, demanding that his brother be released from captivity. Lying wasn't Ned's style, but he chose to lie to Jaime by telling him that he ordered Tyrion to be seized in order to bring him to justice. While I do think this was Ned's first actual attempt at playing the game, you can argue that sticking with the truth wouldn't have done him any favors either. After all, admitting that his wife chose to move against the Lannisters without him knowing would have made him look foolish, which he was. Ned survived the confrontation, but suffered a broken leg. His men, however, were killed on the orders of Jaime. If Ned was still the hand of the king, and if he would have tried to defuse the Tyrion situation with the king the day before, things might have turned out differently. Ned certainly didn't make things easier for himself by stripping himself of power and instigating against Jaime. While Ned was having fever dreams and recovering from a broken leg, Cersei was planning her final move to take Robert out for good. Upon his wake, Ned was pardoned by Robert and reinstated as the hand of the king. Ned soon found himself sitting on the Iron Throne, while Robert went out for his last hunt. One of the matters that he was forced to attend to was a not-so-subtle act of war. He was told that Sir Gregor Clegane had torched and destroyed villages in the Riverlands, no doubt on the orders of Tywin Lannister as a slight on Catelyn's original house. Ned would decide to strip Sir Gregor of all ranks and titles and sentence him to death, and he would also demand that Tywin Lannister present himself at court to answer for the crimes of his bannermen. He would then command Lord Beric Dondarrion and a few other lords and knights to gather men and ride for Clegane's keep to deliver the sentence. In a storm of swords, we learn that this band of lords, knights, and free riders were caught in a trap laid by Tywin and Sir Gregor, which was originally intended to capture Ned. Ned wanted to deliver the sentence with his own sword, but he was unable to go due to his leg injury. His leg injury actually saved him from another decision that would have compromised his position. Of course, you could argue that Ned made this decision expecting to have some sort of support from Robert had he lived. But considering the financial grip that Tywin had on the crown and the fact that his daughter was the queen, even that was debatable. While Ned's decision was controversial at court, an opportunity to gain a powerful ally did arise from it. Sir Loras Tyrell actually volunteered to help deliver justice to Sir Gregor, but Ned refused him, believing that he was out for vengeance. Tywin Lannister was already assembling his army and trying to draw Ned into a war. Ned should have been more open to making an ally out of one of the most popular knights at court, who was born into one of the most powerful houses in Westeros. Ned's political campaign left a lot to be desired, but Ned's detective campaign was looking a lot more promising. He planned on sending his daughters back to Winterfell for their own safety. When he sat them down to deliver the news, Sansa and Arya would give him the hints he needed to come to a conclusion about the line of succession. Joffrey had all of the features of a Lannister, particularly his blonde hair, which contrasted the black hair in all of Robert's bastard children, and the recorded features of House Baratheon. In a desperate attempt to keep her close to Joffrey, Sansa would end up telling Cersei about Ned's plans to have them leave the city, which later helped Cersei prepare for Ned's final move against the crown. This was really unfortunate for Ned, who thought he could trust his daughter to remain silent about this. With Ned's revelation about the royal family, he found the secret he believed Jon Arryn died for, and he would proceed by having a confrontation with Cersei. Ned thought that he had Cersei cornered. In his eyes, as soon as Robert came back from his hunt, her secret would be revealed and that would be the end of her. Ned underestimated what people like Cersei were capable of. This difference in mentality was what gave Cersei the edge over Ned in this scene and in the days that followed. Ned gave Cersei the opportunity to flee the city with her children in an attempt to spare them from death. Meanwhile, Cersei was already in the process of killing Robert. In spite of his honor, Cersei considered Ned to be a huge threat to her, in large part because of the type of man he was and because of the relationship that he shared with the king. This bond with Robert was something that Ned never properly took advantage of, but he was definitely shielded by it. One of Ned's biggest mistakes was letting Cersei know that he knew that her children were born of incest. No doubt Cersei would have found a way to get rid of Ned had he not done it himself. Robert's death had caught Ned by surprise, but if Ned had kept his discovery a secret and pivoted his strategy toward leaving the capital with his head, he might have given himself a better shot at denying Joffrey the throne later on, once he was in the north, and could properly set up a coup with Stannis if that was the hill he wanted to die on. However, Ned followed up his blunder with his next major decision, trusting Littlefinger with his plans to deny Joffrey the throne. When Robert died, Ned was named the Lord Protector of the realm. In one of his final conversations with Littlefinger, Littlefinger let him know that he had all the power he needed within his reach. And Littlefinger was right. All Ned needed to do was play his cards right. He had options on the table, including making peace with the Lannisters and revealing their secret at a more convenient time. But that wasn't Ned's way. Ned's arc as the Hand of the King would end with him confronting Joffrey and Cersei in the throne room, expecting to have the support of the City Watch when denying Joffrey the throne and handing Robert's will over to Cersei. He was then betrayed by Littlefinger and seized into captivity. His final days were mostly spent in the cells of the Red Keep, where Varys would pay him a visit every now and then, until he was convinced to confess and proclaim Joffrey as the true king, with the hopes of sparing his two daughters and spending the rest of his days at the Wall, which resulted in his execution. Ned was an honorable man, but he definitely wasn't savvy enough to survive the Game of Thrones as the Hand of the King. Considering the context behind each situation, his most critical mistakes were resigning from office, threatening Tywin Lannister with an order to court, confronting Cersei about the line of succession, and trusting Littlefinger with his plans of denying Joffrey the throne, with the last two essentially destroying any realistic chance he had of winning. That's it for me. Hit like if you enjoyed the video and subscribe for more content like this. Until next time, peace.